Warning: this episode contains brain food that will lead to improved emotional and social intelligence. Thanks for tuning in to Harvesting Happiness today for a healthy serving of consciously prepared brain food. This is Lisa Cypers-Kamen, your host. For more than 13 years, I've been handcrafting these sound ideas for better well-being. Each week, I love spotlighting diverse thinkers and doers who are contemporary trendsetters and change agents, devoting their lives to creating a better world in which to live. I invite you to listen up and change the way you think about human happiness. Our award-winning content is fresh, optimistic, and purpose-driven media that promotes well-being from the inside out. Alrighty then, let's dive in. This episode offers psychosocial education designed to inspire and motivate our listeners. The information provided does not constitute a therapeutic relationship nor a substitute for professional mental health care. If you are experiencing a mental health crisis, call 911, go to your nearest emergency room, or for listeners in the United States, text 988 for the National Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Thanks for joining me on today's show, where we will talk about a truth recipe, critical thinking, and vaccination against multimedia nonsense. My guest today is Dr. Barry Maurer, who is part of the CIRCE and the Mental Immunity Project with my friend, Dr. Andy Norman. Barry is on the cutting edge of research into cognitive immunity and the threats posed to it by the intersection of illiberal forces and electronic media. Barry is Associate Professor of English at the University of Central Florida and is the author of Deadly Delusions, Right-Wing Death Cult, and the Cognitive Immune System, the Mind's Ability to Dispel Pathological Beliefs. Barry has collaborated on the DARPA-funded project Deep Agent, a framework for information spread and evolution in social networks. He also teaches symposiums on cognitive immunity, including The Age of Mass Delusion, Why Are People Fooled, and Propaganda and Pseudoscience. Welcome, Barry. Thanks for joining me on the show today.
Thank you.
Well, for me, this is a passion project to continue to interview the brightest minds working on CIRCE and the Mental Immunity Project to help educate the public about how we think and how we can fortify our thinking to be more productive and healthy.
Yeah, I'm all for that.
Let's talk about how bad ideas are spread.
Okay. So the common analogy is to viruses and, pandemics and so on. And I support that analogy, but I think there's another one that's needed, which is a cancer analogy. And in humans, cancers can be caused by viruses. So, we have HPV and hepatitis and bacteria too, H. pylori. So there are various ways to spread cancer-causing agents. And of course, we have pollution and carcinogens and things like that in the atmosphere. And the reason why I think that might be a better analogy, or at least a supplementary analogy to the sort of just epidemic pandemic model, is that there's so much complexity when it comes to understanding how minds work and how societies work and why bad ideas end up spreading. So, for example, in cancer research, there's a lot of information now that shows that, particularly among older people, my age certainly, cancer is very common, and it just doesn't develop into tumors. So the body, there's cancer cells that arise all the time, and the body finds ways to get rid of them. We might say the same thing about bad ideas, that they arise both in our minds and we come across them in the environment. And most of the time, if our minds are working well, we get rid of them. And so that's kind of an important factor, is to think about not just being in the midst of bad ideas, because, sometimes you can walk through a whole bunch of bad ideas and none of them stick to you. None of them really get internalized and grow. And sometimes they do. So why does that happen?
That's interesting. And also when I think about your cancer analogy, it's about like a healthy cell that goes rogue, right? That something flips the switch within the cells and then they start to multiply.
Exactly. And a lot of the ideas, and I use the word pathological to describe certain ideas or beliefs, are actually closely related to ideas that are healthy. And one idea I have, or one idea I point to, is something like respect for one's heritage. That can be a healthy thing, but with a slight, kind of twist in it, or I guess mutation, we could say, it can become the belief that my heritage is superior to other people's. And then you get into racism and jingoism and stuff like that. So often we find that unhealthy ideas are really pretty closely related to healthy ideas.
So it could also be thought of as that with every bad idea or untruth, there's always the kernel of truth from where it starts.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I look at some of the really paranoid stuff going around, like, they're putting microchips in vaccines and things like that. I mean, it sounds completely nuts, and it is, but it's related to this kernel of truth, which is we know that historically medical research has been abused. We know historically that the healthcare industry has been at times more interested in profit than it has been in common welfare. So you can certainly say, I'm concerned about the healthcare industry, I'm concerned about the pharmaceutical industry. And with a slight mutation, you can say they're putting microchips in vaccines.
Yeah.
So,
it's out there.
yeah.
But one can see, like when you dissect the thread or start pulling on that loose thread, how it takes you down the rabbit hole to the origin of the thought.
Yeah. Yeah. And if only we could pull people back and say, yeah, look, there are some valid concerns about the pharmaceutical industry. Let's talk about those.
Yes.
Microchips is not one of them.
No, microchips is not one of them. And if we're worried about being tracked and followed, I think that our cellular devices and our smart TVs and our personal assistants, our digital assistants that we have in our house probably offer more of a chance of that than
Yes.
a vaccine.
Yeah. Yeah. Just, the truth is often in plain sight and doesn't require like super detective skills to figure out. I mean, it's just all around you, right in front of you. So it's just really noticing, what our common everyday habits are and how those common everyday habits are tied into massive institutions that we live in and among every day. And this is attainable knowledge. I mean, I think part of the attraction to people who go down these paranoid routes is that we're uncovering secrets, right? And I've got privy to some secret knowledge or something like that. And really, a lot of this stuff it's not secret. There's public record on how corporations use our information. There's public record on how cell phones and other devices collect information from us. It's not hidden. It's
And we
right
have
there.
some controls over that actually as well.
We do have some controls over it. Yeah. I mean, sometimes we don't. Like there are now cameras in public places that will take your license information, whatever. You don't necessarily have control, but some things we still do. So, yeah, it's mostly out there to know. So we don't need to go into like I'm super secret sleuth mode to learn about the world. We just need to look around us a lot more.
There were two thoughts that came to mind as you were saying that. One is being attracted or connecting with sort of the conspiracy groups does give people a sense of belonging and connection, right? Which, because we're so disconnected at this point in society, it does give meaning to some people.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see how that happens. But the other part of it is a lack of trust in the data when you do present it to somebody and say, look, here's the information, here's the data, here's the research, and then they still might not believe it.
Right. And what we've seen really over the last 50 or more years is a decline, major declines in trust in the sort of pillars of the society, the major institutions of the society, so that the trust in, for example, educators and scientists and experts of all kind has fallen off a cliff. But I would say a lot of that is engineered, this mistrust. And you can look at things like, the public relations campaign over cancer warnings for cigarettes, or now climate change and things like that.
What climate change? And I say that tongue in cheek. Is there climate change?
Right. So we know that, for example, there have been very, very expensive and just very full-on wars against expertise carried on by corporations who want to sow doubt, and that the impact of that is felt in the general population as a massive mistrust in institutions. The problem is that, some institutions are sowing the rewards of that mistrust, like the oil and gas
monetary
industry.
Rewards.
Yeah, the tobacco industry. They're literally profiting off the decay in trust of scientific experts and people like that. Have people like me, for example, who try to point out, well, here's the real problem, and say, no, you're part of the conspiracy.
Yes. Yes, people like us, they do view people who are interested in uncovering truth as part of the problem, which is, I find, very, very interesting. Yeah. And the other thing that I hear is, well, you can't believe the data because it all depends on how it was collected. It all depends upon how the research was set up, and you can skew the results. And I suppose that is true to a degree, but the data is still the data.
Yeah. So what I would say to people is, unless you're an expert in forensic methods in a particular field, like measuring CO2 levels in the atmosphere, then you really shouldn't weigh in on this stuff. There's different arenas of discussion, right? And one is forensics, and that's where experts in a particular field learn how to collect data and interpret data and so on. And unless you're a trained expert in that field, it's very, very, you don't even understand what they're talking about, and I say this, my dad's a medical researcher, and he starts talking about, the glomerulus or something like that. And I don't know what the hell he's talking about. So
what is that?
He's a kidney, he researches kidneys. So it has something to do with the kidney and filtration system or something. But, I'm not going to have an opinion about how the kidney works because I don't even know what these words mean, or how these experts collect data on those things. I'm going to trust that they've figured it out for the most part. And so we have a number of arenas of discussion that when something becomes a public issue, it's already been through forensic, dialectic, dialogic, and rhetorical processes. And by the time it becomes a public issue, usually a lot of experts have looked at it in those terms and kind of settled on a consensus. And then the public gets to weigh in, but without really having access to those dimensions. Maybe they come in at the end at like the rhetorical, and then they have a verbal battle about it. But, I know enough just from my own discipline of, whatever media studies, that it's a steep hill to climb to even get to the point where you understand the language that people are using to talk about these things. So
that's a really good point. We're going to need to take a break, but I want to just mention one more thing before we jump off for a second. And that is that even when you do the research online about a particular subject, the first several pages of that search are so front loaded with nonsense, right? That's the other thing that I started to discover when I wanted to, when I would get in conversations with people and I said, look, I'm interested in the facts and the data, and I'm going to do some research. I realized that, like the first 3 or 4 pages were all about these conspiracy theorists sort of impregnating the internet. So you get worn out. You don't want to go deeper.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the logic of the algorithm, right?
Yeah.
It's to drag you. Eyeballs attract eyeballs. So it's like all the people looking at the accident attract more people looking
Yeah.
at the, and then it's also possible to manipulate the system where, you can hire someone to get your website higher up in the rankings. It doesn't necessarily mean what you are offering is true or useful or anything.
Yeah.
So
The
yeah,
value of truth has
yeah.
become diminished. Let's take a break. And when we come back, we'll continue the conversation with Professor Barry Maurer. We're talking about the CIRCE project and the cognitive immunity and his book, also Deadly Delusions, Right-Wing Death Cult, and the Cognitive Immune System, the Mind's Ability to Dispel Pathological Beliefs. To learn more, you can go over to ResearchGate. That's true, researchgate.net, and under the profile of Barry Maurer, and that's Mauer. Here comes the pause. We'll be right back. Each day, we have the intellectual freedom to be happy or the liberty to be miserable, regardless of external circumstance. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health, seek support because good psychological health is vital in the achievement of a happy and satisfying life. Visit harvestinghappiness.com for psychosocial educational resources to boost emotional and social intelligence. Like what you hear on Harvesting Happiness? Sharing is caring. Pay it forward by spreading the word to your community and through social media. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes from wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. And we're back, continuing the exploration of the truth recipe, critical thinking, and vaccination against multimedia nonsense. My guest today is Dr. Barry Maurer. Let's get back to it. Let's go back to our conversation because you talk about belief evaluation is as important as the beliefs that we hold themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk a little about that. I think this is fascinating.
Yeah. So this is really, I think, the mind immune system at work is our belief evaluation system. That's almost like our antibodies, and they're either functioning well or they're not. So I express it this way. I said, whenever you have a belief, there's actually two beliefs. One is the content of the belief itself, and the other is your assessment of that belief. So, for example, I can have a particular, and I like to use a 10-point scale going positive and negative, right? So, for example, I believe that Canada is a country. Okay. How strong is my belief in that? It's a positive 10. Okay. It is possible to have a belief where it's a 0. And I would say a 0 would be something like suspended. Like, in other words, that belief is suspended as you're considering it. So I don't know yet where it's going to go, but I'm going to put it 0 for now. And it could be a negative 10. Like it could be like, I don't know, Barry is the name of a country. Okay, a real country. No, negative 10. I don't believe that's true. So in other words, we have this sort of scale. And there is a tendency in communities of skeptics to ask, for example, on a scale of 1 to 10, how strong is your belief in this thing? And the tendency there is to sort of penalize people who go right to 10 because you're too certain, But I don't think that that's necessarily a great way. I think it's a good idea to probe people and ask them, really, how strong is your belief in this? But I don't think we should penalize people who start with a 10, especially around something like, is Canada a country? Yes, it is. I mean, I'm not going to penalize anybody who says 10, but it's good to think about a sort of scale and where we are. If you look at scientific consensus around things like climate change, for example, they will have a scale, a certainty scale, and they, I think, do it out of 100%. Like, so it's, we're 98.6% certain that climate change is happening and that it's human made and so forth.
But going back to the beliefs and asking somebody to sort of qualify their belief, right, on a scale.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you ask people who are mired in conspiracy theories that question,
Yeah.
to talk about your love of the United States. They might say it's absolute 10, unquestioning, and I'm
Yeah.
there. But it's kind of a contrast, right? Because if they love their country, then why are they at odds with everything around them?
Yeah. Well, we could look at love in different ways, but I think usually there's a kind of right-wing reaction, which is to say, if you love your country, you can't be critical of parts of its history or things like that. There's sort of a core pathological belief, I would say, in that, which is that you're either with us or against us, which is the same logic that maybe, gangs and cults have. So I would probably point that out and just say, do you really want to commit yourself to this logic that is the logic of a gang or a cult? In other words, unquestioning loyalty, no matter what your group or your side does, is a very ethically bad position to take. And on the other hand, you can certainly love things that are deeply flawed and have lots of problems and want to address those problems. And that's not pathological. So again, like it's a mutation, right? To go from, I love this thing, I recognize that it's flawed, to I love this thing, I can't see any flaws. But also the deeper part of belief evaluation is to say, I'm willing to accept things that count as evidence, and I'm willing to use reasoning to figure out how evidence fits into a claim about the world. And the problem with people who kind of short circuit or, develop, I would call like a mind tumor around something like this, is that we use certain phrases to describe it. One is seize and freeze, right? Like sort of seize on the first pieces of evidence that come along and then freeze your belief at that. So, and often that first piece of evidence that comes along is wrong. So, it's important to sometimes reevaluate evidence, but also I think it's really important when we're talking about these things to not assume everyone is a rational actor. In fact, I would assume the opposite, that no one is a rational actor, and sort of begin with the notion that we shouldn't expect small children, for example, to be able to understand evidence and reasoning, because those things are learned. They're very difficult to learn, and even experts struggle with them. So I think we're all kind of in that learning and shouldn't expect ourselves to be perfect.
And this brings us to the point of interviews like this, our time together, and that is education, right? When we start to educate ourselves on how things like this can happen, how radicalism occurs, whether it's homegrown or in some other country, it usually comes from the absence of education around that subject.
Yeah, or miseducation, but early childhood stuff is really critical. Again, a lot of the things I talk about with people, the kind of first reaction is, how do we deprogram people who are in cults or their minds are pathological or whatever? I say, well, that's a tall order, tough challenge. That's almost like saying, how do we cure people with stage 4 cancer? Well, it's worth the effort, but it's a lot better for the society would be to work on removing carcinogens from the environment. So like prevention is much, much better, and education is our prevention if it's done right. So what should education be? In my mind, it's the content of education is important, but the most important things are really for people a sense of trust and a sense of belonging. That when those things are established fairly early on, and people can have a basic sense of trust in themselves and in the world, they're less likely to be pulled into things like conspiracy theories and cults. And of course, it's not just the job of education to provide those things. It's we really the parents and other caregivers have a huge role to play in that. And you can't expect family systems that are sick to produce healthy individuals. And it does happen sometimes. People might grow up in a sick system and be like, find their way through it, but it's not easy.
Well, that self-determinism, is a form of leadership, actually. And it does happen. I have witnessed it happen, and it's pretty cool, but it's not the norm. Usually we just replicate the
Yeah,
family system.
right, right. And there's a lot of research on, kind of epigenetics and also inherited trauma and things like that, events from 100 years ago can be impacting your life and you maybe don't know it. But yes, we're so used to thinking of ourselves as self-willed and self-directed. And I often like to think that, I'm a cork on the ocean. I mean, there's so many kinds of waves and currents and forces going on in the ocean, which includes the history of humanity and the history of the world and so on. That yes, with I'm a little bit more than a cork because I have arms and I can, eyes, and I can kind of look around me and maybe paddle in a direction, but the ocean is still there. It's still huge, and I have way less control than I would like to think I have.
But we do have control in one domain, which I think is part of this project, which is the self-mastery angle, that we can learn to control our actions through education, through critical thinking, through cognitive immunity, through mental immunity.
Yes. And in terms of those things, I'm very much a fan of all the work being done in cognitive science and social science research and the pro-social movement and evolutionary psychology and all these kinds of things. But really, I think they're just supplemental to the kinds of educational practices that were begun 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece. That the kind of classical virtues were pretty sound, and that we're just amending them with the science we're doing now. So, I like to point to one in particular, which is prudence, which is not only thinking wisely about your goals, but thinking about your moves towards those goals and using constraint when necessary. So we are in a society that really encourages people to let go of constraint.
Yeah.
And that can mean, go binge drink or buy a fast car or spend money you don't have, or whatever kind of, we might say, irresponsible behavior. I'm not saying never do these things. I'm just saying that there's a lot of messages encouraging us to kind of let go of constraint. And I'm also not saying you should, tie yourself up in a knot and be like super tight about everything, but be wise about your choices. And there's also a sort of slogan for the arts, which is constraints enable. That almost all of the great artists learn how to use constraints in a creative way, not to imprison themselves, but to liberate themselves. So if you look at the traditions of knowledge, wisdom, and education, they're all about teaching people to use constraints wisely.
Yes, and I'm also thinking about Buddhist principles and the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path to Enlightenment. They are a structure, right? They're not the exact map because the map is different for everyone, but the structure is there.
Yeah. Or I think it was the poet Basho said, not to follow in the footsteps of the master, but to seek what they sought. So
I like that.
Yeah.
Well, we are out of time, but I love this conversation, and our listeners can get more of Professor Barry Maurer by jumping on over to our special Substack to learn more. To connect with Barry Maurer and learn about his work, go over to researchgate.net and under profile, Barry Maurer, and that's Mauer. And the books that we've been touching upon today are Deadly Delusions, Right-Wing Death Cult, And the cognitive immune system, the mind's ability to dispel pathological beliefs, that is a chapter in a bigger book whose name is far too long for me to remember. But maybe you've got it pulled up and you can share, Barry.
Yes, it is called Global Modernity from Coloniality to Pandemic, a Cross-Disciplinary Perspective.
There we go. Thanks, Barry. Thanks for sharing part of your day with me.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Harvesting Happiness today. This is Lisa Cypers-Kamen on behalf of my guest, Dr. Barry Maurer, wishing you kind thoughts, kinder words, and the kindest of action. Until next time, remember, happiness is an inside job. Happiness is your inside job. Please go out and rock your day and remember to be kind to one another. Want to take a deeper dive into sound ideas for better well-being? Check out our new bonus edition content, More Mental Fitness by Harvesting Happiness, available exclusively on Medium and Substack. Keep harvesting your own happiness anytime, anywhere from the comfort of wherever you are. Subscribe, listen, and share hundreds of downloadable episodes from wherever you get your podcasts. Connect with and follow us on most social media channels. To learn more about lifestyle management and mental fitness consulting services, please visit harvestinghappiness.com. Harvesting Happiness and More Mental Fitness are produced by me, Lisa Cypers-Kamen, Andrea Mengele, Robin Boyd, Andrea Daly, and the awesome team at Podfly Productions, including Eric Begay, Kimberly Beck, and Alec Guess, in collaboration with TogiNet Radio, KBUU, RadioMalibu.net, and is available on PRX, the Public Radio Exchange.